All right, good afternoon. I know we're trying to get caught up on time, so we might go a little bit fast. I want to treat this more like a 4,000 level class than the 1,000 level class. Welcome in. I am Dr. James Gilley. It is good to see you all back. I know I pitched this Friday afternoon. Every time y'all had a geopolitics question, I said, see me Saturday, and it's Saturday. So let's get into it. The title of this talk is Cosmopolitics, Resource Conflict, Great Power Politics, and Outer Space. And I am just going to warn you that this is very preliminary work on a bigger project I'm working on. So if it seems half-baked, that means it's more baked than I thought it was. So we'll be good to go there. All right. So when we're talking about geopolitics, that's a very specific thing within the realm of political science. And what geopolitics is at its core is the politics of power, geography, and resources. So before we can even get into the bigger picture of how geopolitics is going to play out in space, probably should spend just a little bit of time on what geopolitics means. So when I'm saying power, what I'm talking about is the ability to make an actor, someone else out there, do what they otherwise wouldn't do. Now, there is a wide variety of ways you can make people do what they wouldn't normally want to do. You can punch them in the face till they do what you want to do. You can pay them to do what they want to do, or you can convince them that this is the right course of action, right? There's many different approaches you can take here. All of those are types of power. And all of those are available to all of the actors within the system. They might just have different levels of power available to them. Second is the concept of geography. This is land, this is territory, this is control over space, and this one gets me in trouble in political science circles all the time. When we're saying space, this time, we're going to be talking about, actual like X, Y, Z. We're not talking about the kind we like. Although we're going to get to the kind we like real soon, so just bear with me here. And the third thing are resources. And resources include a lot more than just minerals, right? We've kind of heard this refrain over and over through the course of this weekend, right? That people are our big resource, their ability to use minerals, their ability to create infrastructure, all of these different things factor into the concept of resources. So you put all of these three things together and you get what we call geopolitics. So geopolitics has been a part of discussions about outer space, right? Both on the space side and on the political science side for a while now. So there has developed a traditional view of what geopolitics is, and it usually is about controlling low Earth orbit, right? Kind of a traditional geopolitical concern. You'll hear this talked about as space as the ceiling or space as the high ground. This is very standard, right? If you can control the high ground, right? Anakin have the high ground sort of deal, right? That's the ultimate level of control there. And traditionally, great powers are those that are the states that are capable of influencing within the international sphere. So we're talking about the people that have enough power to push everyone else around. They're also typically the ones who are capable of operation in space. So if we extrapolate this a little bit further, run this out 2050s, 2075, somewhere around there, we kind of get a general picture of who the great powers in space are going to be, who the players are going to be. Now, that's not to say that there might be someone that comes up completely out of nowhere, but we can kind of futurist project out to that time frame to see who these great power players are going to be. Obviously, USA is one. Russia, we're going to keep them on the board. We might could actually debate that one, but I'm going to keep Russia on the board just because those rockets, they've been going for 70 years, and you probably use the exact same rocket for the next 70. The Chinese are very much on the board as great power players. But I would like to also introduce Japan as a separate actor, the European Union with the UK, let's not get into that today, as an actor, India, Brazil, maybe we can throw Iran on there. I'm willing to have that debate. I'm going to keep them off for today because we can talk about that after. So this is kind of the traditionalist view of what geopolitics is about, right? Control over land, territory, space only matters as an extension of a domain of the great powers. It's not really a domain of itself. And we've seen over the last 20 years, some people dip their toe in to try to expand this idea of geopolitics in space. I'm not the first one. We're going to do a little bit of a lit review here just to check in on what the thought is at this point in time. We're going to cover three big thinkers and their big works that influence the way that we think about space and great power conflict. So our first one is probably the seminal book called Astropolitik by Everett Dolman. He is currently at I believe the U.S. the Air Warfare College, Air War College, something like that. He literally came up with the idea of extending great power politics into space. This is that first big leap, right? This is still viewing space as primarily being concerned with low Earth orbits, kind of getting into cislunar space, maybe projecting out to kind of that area, but really that's about where it ends. The gravity well is about where everything ends. And this is very predicated. I mean, this is 2001. This book came out 25 days after 9/11. So that's the framework. We're still pre-9/11 thinking here when this came out. This is very much an old space model, outer space treaties in force, national space programs, right? Everything running through the nation states themselves. The notion of a private space actor that could use reusable rockets. No one's even thinking about that. That is literally science fiction at that point in time. What really matters here, though, is I think the big extension from all of the social sciences when we look at space. That when you put people there, the same things are going to apply. The same principles are there. So traditional geopolitics models can be extended into outer space. I think that's a pretty important foundational observation. It's not a completely different realm. It might have different things that go into it, but it's not something we can't understand. So, for example, this treats low Earth orbit more like littoral or coastal waters. Resources are still key to understanding state action. You can control the territory of space. If you can have territorial control over space, then you can control the battle space and the domain of warfighting. Very standard Air Force kind of stuff. And then the field kind of went fallow for about 20 years. The next two we're going to talk about have come out in the last 2 years or so. The first one is Dark Skies by Deudney in 2020. And I want to tell you, I was there when he had a big presentation conference of it, and he was the only person in the room that was on his side. It was glorious. But at the end of the day, the longer I've walked away from this and the more I've thought about it, he's got some good points. And let's get into those right here. He actually presents a very pessimistic case about geopolitics in space. He presents the idea that going into space is itself a civilizational threat. At first you laugh, and the longer I've sat with this, the more I might have a little bit of a point here. So he actually sees the idea of space colonization as increasing the likelihood of civilizational ending conflict, particularly nuclear conflict, right? He is bringing back to the forefront this idea that nuclear exchanges, that happens through space, right? That is the technologies that drive our ability to get into space are the technologies that drive us to the ability to just wipe out all life on the face of this earth, right? If we go back and we look at why we wanted to, if you go back and you look at the politics of why we wanted to put a man in space, a man weighs roughly the same amount as a nuclear weapon. A capsule, if you can put it wherever you want, you can drop a nuke wherever you want. Point to Dr. Deudney. At the same time, he also views that the technologies that would allow us and empower us to settle in space double down on our ability to kill all of the humans at one time. If you have the ability to do an asteroid diversion, you have the ability to divert that asteroid onto the face of the Earth. See season 4 of The Expanse. Season 4. If you have the ability to put a man in space, you have the ability to put a nuclear weapon wherever you want to put it. If you have the ability to put a satellite in space, you have the ability to drop a rod from God and from space, right? These technologies are empowering conflict as well. And ultimately, he views Earth as an oasis Earth. Yes, Mars society, I agree with this. Mars has everything we need to build a civilization, but you have to build it. I can walk outside right now and breathe, drink the water out of that fountain, and eat a cactus if I wanted to. I wouldn't recommend any of those things, except the breathing, do the breathing. I would say, right, we can do that. This is the only planet we know we can do that on. If we want to do it somewhere else, it's going to take a lot of effort to make that happen. So ultimately, Dr. Deudney comes down on the side that the potential for conflict outweighs the benefit of backing up humanity, and that was the thing that got him yelled at by literally 200 people. Made for a really good discussion, but I do have to give point to Dr. Deudney on the technologies that empower space are the technologies that empower the ability to end all human life in one go. The most recent one is from Dr. Bowen. I'm going to punt. He is a lovely Welsh man. I love Dr. Bowen. I think I met him at Mars Society a few years back. Again, I'm sorry, I can't do the name, but I really like Dr. Bowen. He is the most recent publication updating the geopolitical model in space. This is the newest approach we've got out there. He really brings in grand strategy to interpret our actions in space. He very deliberately treats Earth orbit as coastal waters. He builds on that Dolman model. It's very good if you're into the game theory sort of stuff. And he keeps the focus on great space powers, right? He essentially pulls the people and actors that are capable of space action out as space powers, right? In much the same way that you go back to 1911 and look at ocean power as the big thing, right? The ocean power players there. And he deliberately applies a Clausewitzian, right? Karl von Clausewitz, war is politics by other means, approach to space conflict and space actions and space strategy. But he still keeps it on nation states. And that's going to be my major thing to point out here. So that's kind of your brief literature review. Go check these three guys out. Their work is great. Hopefully there'll be a Dr. Gilley one at some point there as well, but we'll see. So here are the big problems that I've been able to identify in the current literature. Space resources in this current view, right, going with the Dr. Bowen view even today, they're still primarily focused on low Earth orbit, on satellites, the impact on terrestrial resources. They just don't look at the wider amount of resources further out and the competition that might be driven there. This is like pet peeve number one, the focus is only on nation states as space actors, but private space actors are already playing a major role in geopolitics apart from nation states. SpaceX, Starlink in Ukraine, emerging in Iran, that's not a DoD-driven project. I mean, it might be now with some funding, but that's not a DoD-driven project. That was Elon answering a tweet and actually delivering some, the company of SpaceX. It was Elon answering a tweet. I'll get that one in just a minute. That's already playing an immense role in geopolitics. This Ukraine conflict has shown that private space actors can play a huge role. Private commercial satellite vendors are providing real-time or near real-time intelligence that allows for targeting by Ukrainians against Russian forces. Private space actors are currently playing a major role in great power politics. We're just not acknowledging it as a separate thing. So once the conversation leaves Earth's gravity well, that's really where the current model ends. Everything that's being discussed right now solely focuses on, at most, the moon. You get out of our gravity well and the conversation really stops. And that's where it should really begin. So this leaves me the big question of what happens when humanity becomes multiplanetary. What does that do to the model of geopolitics in space? And I keep going back and forth on the terminology I use there. We're going to workshop that later. Ultimately, the big thing here is space resource conflict beyond the Terran gravity well, right? The real resources that people want. I mean, yeah, okay, helium-3 on the moon, cool. Ice on the moon, great. We want the asteroids. The asteroids are way out there. That's the real prize, right? Right, we saw all sorts of great meteorites last night. That's the stuff we want. And that's the stuff that the competition is going to be over. And right, that's where the real geopolitics are going to come back in. Planetary resources, not so much. More useful for in situ resource utilization, development of settlement locations. I've got some more stuff on that later on. But generally speaking, gravity gets in the way. It's too hard to launch those resources back. Intellectual property, we've seen that refrain over and over this weekend. So really, it's the instance of humanity, the new settlement, that's going to benefit most from the planetary resources. So the focus on inter-sovereign conflict should be asteroid cometary resources. And we can look at them in many ways, I think, as kind of an analog of ocean bed resources in international waters. I think that's the model to kind of take for this. That's the part of this that I really want to develop out as we move forward. Also, the big interesting thing here is who gets a territorial and positional claim over the asteroid belt? Does the belt get a right belt for LOTA, belt for the belters? I know we're Mars people, but OPA. But does Mars own that? Does Jupiter own that? Is it its own thing? And the conflict over these resources, sorry, internet for the right, Mars and Jupiter could both have a territorial claim here, right? And it could go either way, right? There could be right, one or the other claiming it for themselves. This could either drive conflict in a much more heavy way, or it could right, be much more of a carving up an economic pie. I can see this one going either way. This is kind of the second thing I really want to build out as I continue to think about geopolitics in space. The conflict in space is also going to be more than just the terrestrial great powers. I listed out those countries that have the ability to go to space, but there are other things that matter to this. Non-state actors really are the most, at this point, I would say, are the most capable of action in space. Now, there's a lot of defense issues that run along with that, right? And especially US ones are caught in with ITAR. Who's going to stop a private space actor from doing space defense things? The Outer Space Treaty does not apply to private actors, but it does apply to launching states. And right, there's a whole legal geopolitical mess with those broken outer space treaties. And then, right, I guess the ultimate direction I take this is what happens when you have a private space military corporation, right? PMCs are scary enough. What happens when they're in space, right? We talk about earlier, we talked about point-to-point Marines, also space Marines, but what happens when those space Marines aren't US Marines, but they're Weyland-Yutani Marines? Whole other can of worms there. So that's worth building out later on. And that's just one, right? That's one side of the three-sided coin here. The third side are sovereign non-terrestrial actors. See also, I will refer you back to the internet recording of Thursday's presentation, right? Sovereign entities are going to seek to defend themselves, as is their right and as is their duty as a sovereign actor. So a sovereign Mars not only could, but must defend their own territorial waters, their own territoriality. And how does that all get defined? The bigger direction to take that is, what do you do with the asteroid belt? And ultimately, once you establish multiple sovereign entities out there, right? Once Mars exists in opposition to an Earth as a singular Mars, does that kind of force Earth to operate in a single entity? They're probably going to be much more powerful because right, it's where all the humans really are. So does that make Earth the space superpower, able to push everyone else around there? Watch The Expanse. It's literally that story. You just kind of end up there. They did a great job of gaming out the politics on that. But that becomes a very vibrant question, right? How does the long-term play out of geopolitics play out when there is more than one sovereign political entity in space trying to control resources? So these are kind of the 7 big takeaways that I've got that I really want to continue to further develop and hopefully get some good stuff on as we move forward. Kind of 7 big points. Number 1 is resources will drive astropolitical, cosmopolitical, we're still working on that, conflict. But it's probably going to take a different shape than we've seen at this point. It's not going to be about controlling orbits. It's going to be about controlling actual resources. Not to say that satellite orbits aren't a resource to our space law friends, but y'all, asteroids. Number 2, nation states are not going to be the only actor out there. There will be private actors, there will be non-state sovereign entities or planets, right? There's going to be more actors into the system, so it makes the game theory much more complex. Number 3, the real astropolitical conflict is going to take place well beyond Earth orbit. Earth orbit, Earth's gravity well, super important, but I think it's probably a better way to think of gravity wells almost as single theaters, right? Earth is like the European theater. Mars and its moons, their own theater. But I think gravity wells and orbits are going to be the more potent realm to think of in outer space. Number 4, new space powers will emerge as humanity becomes multiplanetary. And the more we go into space, if we've got if we're launching 100 tons at a time, 3 times a day, right? There's just simply going to be more space powers that emerge. This is pretty simple there. 5, Mars has the potential to make the asteroid belt part of its sphere of influence. Maybe not the whole thing, right? We get into the whole OPA sort of idea, but Mars does have the potential, because it's the closest thing to the asteroid belt going out system, to dominate that resource chain, which I think itself could cause major geopolitical conflict between Earth and Mars along the way. I pitched sovereign Mars to produce conflict, but every time you try to do that, more conflict's going to come up somewhere. Number 6, conflict does not have to be solved by military force. War is a costly lottery. Going to war is expensive. Going to war in space is very expensive, until it's not very expensive throwing rocks. But economics is going to play a major role in, well, driving this resource conflict, but it's going to play an even bigger role in reducing the conflict. Trade deals are important. And when trade breaks down, that's when states go to war. So that's important to remember. And number 7, Mars Society, we're all about this. A sovereign and independent Mars, and other instances of humanity, have a great potential to reduce conflict if you price in that conflict from the beginning. You have to be cognizant that it's not utopian. The more you go to claim resources, it is going to drive a potential for conflict. So if you take that into account from the beginning, right, in your structures, in your overall inter-system politics, then you have the potential to reduce it. So that's going to do it for there. We should have a couple minutes for questions. Probably 2 questions is all we have no time for.
Thanks, really enjoyed your talk. In regards to the Space Force and Mahan and his similar work on sea power and how it affects history, do you think perhaps the United States made a mistake when they founded the Space Force and made it more of an extension of the Air Force in terms of domain, as opposed to more a naval type power thinking over a broader scale?
So was spinning it off from the Air Force worse than spinning it off from the Navy? I think just where we'd already built our infrastructure for space, it was always going to come out of the Air Force. I think in the long run, it develops more like a Navy. I think the biggest mistake with founding Space Force was not also throwing cyber under their remit. But that's a whole other, that's what we should have done. But that we'll work on that, hopefully. One more?
I was just curious about your opinion on where these private entities would operate from, maybe Aston, for instance.
So getting from Earth out, somebody's going to buy, is it Kenya that's right on the equator on Africa with that long India? I think it's Kenya. Somebody's going to buy off that government. It's going to happen. I really think that there's a huge opportunity for space development there. When it comes to operating in the asteroid belt, I'm kind of the model that I don't know. I'm still working on that part. I'll just be honest with you. I'm still working on how that's going to work. I personally favor a model of treating the asteroid belt as a single entity itself. So kind of Ceres is the capital, but all those resources there. So if Mars is for Mars, then the asteroid belt is for the belt. This is more of a conflict mitigation thing down the road, but that's very early baking on that concept. Oh, well, last one.
So, do you think that we could see private entities going into kind of a Dutch East India trading company model where, the nation state and the private entity are inextricably intertwined and they also become one and the other?
I think that's the only way we actually sell Mars. I think the Dutch East India Company is the model of how it's going to have to be a private corporation, because we can't there's just not enough political buy-in terrestrially for it. I love us all. We all want it to happen. It's going to have to be a private company that does it. But I think that company serves more in the role as, if you're, U.S.-Taiwan relations, right? We don't have a State Department in Taiwan. But there's a private corporation that does that. So there'll be something, right? There'll be a Martian trade corporation is basically how I think it's going to play out. But that's a whole other talk. All right. Thank you. We should look afterwards as well. Thank you.